I never thought I'd watch someone try to drown my disabled dad at the lake until Margaret Henderson, our HOA president, decided she'd had enough of what she called wheelchair eyesores, ruining her precious waterfront view. It was a Tuesday morning in July, and Dad was having one of his better days. The physical therapy sessions had been helping, and for the first time in weeks, he'd asked me to take him down to the lake. You have to understand, this wasn't just any lake to us. This was Dad's sanctuary, the one place where the constant pain in his legs seemed to fade away, where the shrapnel wounds from Afghanistan didn't throb quite as much. The gentle lapping of water against the shore was better than any prescription medication his doctors had given him. I was helping him position his wheelchair at the water's edge, adjusting the brake locks so he could safely dip his feet in the cool water when I heard those click-clacking heels on the wooden pier behind us. Margaret's voice cut through the morning peace like a rusty blade. "Excuse me, but this is private property." I turned around slowly, already feeling that familiar knot forming in my stomach. Margaret stood there in her pristine white tennis outfit, her blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, holding a clipboard like it was some kind of weapon. At 62, she had the kind of aggressive energy that comes from having too much time and too little genuine purpose in life. "Good morning, Margaret," I said, keeping my voice as level as possible. "Dad's just getting some therapy time in the water." Her lips pursed into that expression I'd come to know so well over the past 6 months since she'd taken over as HOA president. It was the look of someone who genuinely believed that other people's suffering was a personal inconvenience to her. "I don't care what you call it," she snapped. "This lakefront area is for residents who actually contribute to the community aesthetic. Your father's situation is bringing down property values." Dad's shoulders tensed. I could see him gripping the wheels of his chair tighter, his knuckles going white. He'd been a proud man his whole life, a decorated veteran who'd served 3 tours overseas before that IED changed everything. Being talked about like he was some kind of decoration problem was killing him slowly, day by day. "Margaret, we've been over this," I said, stepping protectively closer to Dad's chair. "We have every right to use the lake. We live here, we pay our HOA dues, and—" "Your dues don't cover the emotional distress your presence causes other residents," she interrupted, her voice rising. "Mrs. Peterson's grandchildren were here last week and started crying because they were afraid of the wheelchair. Do you have any idea how that affects our community reputation?" That's when something inside me snapped. Not the explosive kind of anger, but the cold, calculating fury that comes when someone crosses a line you didn't even know existed. I was about to respond when Margaret made the mistake that would change everything. She walked directly up to Dad's wheelchair, grabbed the handles, and started pushing him toward the deeper water. "Maybe if you can't take a hint," she snarled, "you need a more direct message." The wheelchair was moving faster than Dad could stop it. The front wheels hit the slope where the grass met the water, and suddenly, he was rolling toward the deeper section of the lake. Dad tried to grab the wheel rims, but his hands were still weak from the nerve damage. The chair was picking up momentum. "Stop!" I screamed, lunging forward. But Margaret wasn't stopping. If anything, she was pushing harder, her face twisted with a rage that seemed completely disconnected from reality. This wasn't about property values anymore. This was about power, about putting someone she saw as lesser in their place. The front wheels of Dad's chair hit the water with a splash. Then the footrests went under. Dad was trying to reach the brake levers, but the angle was wrong, and Margaret was still pushing from behind. "This is what happens when you don't listen," she hissed through gritted teeth. I reached them just as the water hit the wheel hubs. Dad's legs were completely submerged now, and the electrical components of his medical devices were starting to spark. I grabbed Margaret's wrists and yanked her hands away from the wheelchair handle so hard that she stumbled backward onto the pier. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I roared, immediately turning to help Dad. His breathing was rapid and shallow, panic setting in. The water was up to his thighs, and the chair was still sinking slightly into the soft lake bottom. I waded in quickly, water soaking through my sneakers, and started pulling the wheelchair backward toward shore. "Dad, you're okay," I kept repeating, as much for myself as for him. "You're okay. I've got you." Behind us, Margaret was dusting herself off like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't just tried to drown a disabled veteran in broad daylight. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before bringing that thing around decent people," she called out, her voice carrying that same self-righteous tone she used at HOA meetings. I got Dad safely back onto dry ground and immediately knelt down to check on him. His legs were soaked, and his face was pale with shock, but he seemed physically unharmed. What scared me more was the look in his eyes. It wasn't fear, it was defeat. "Son," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "maybe she's right. Maybe I shouldn't come here anymore." That's when I knew this wasn't over. This wasn't going to be one of those situations where we just moved on and tried to avoid conflict. Margaret Henderson had just declared war on my family, and she had no idea who she was dealing with. I looked up at her, still standing on that pier in her perfect white outfit, clipboard clutched to her chest like armor, and I made a promise to myself right then and there, to understand why Margaret's attack felt like a knife through my heart. You need to know what that lake meant to my family. It wasn't just water and fish to us. It was 50 years of memories, 3 generations of healing, and the one place on earth where my father could still feel like the man he used to be. Dad wasn't always in a wheelchair. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres was a force of nature in his prime. 6'2", broad shoulders that could carry a wounded soldier for miles, and hands that could disarm an explosive device with the precision of a surgeon. He joined the Army straight out of high school, not because he had to, but because he believed in something bigger than himself. 23 years of service, 3 combat tours, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Bronze Star for valor. The IED that ended his military career happened on a routine patrol outside Kandahar. Dad never talks about the details, but I've read the official report. He threw himself on top of a younger soldier when the device detonated, absorbing most of the shrapnel in his legs and lower back. That soldier went home to his wife and twin daughters. Dad came home with nerve damage that would never fully heal and a left leg that doctors said would never work properly again. But here's what the medical reports couldn't capture. Dad came home with guilt that ate at him from the inside out. Guilt that he'd survived when others didn't. Guilt that he couldn't walk his daughter down the aisle at her wedding. Guilt that he needed help getting in and out of bed. The physical pain was manageable with medication. The emotional pain was killing him slowly. That's when my great-grandfather's old stories started making sense. Grandpa Joe had bought property around Pine Lake back in 1973, not because it was cheap, but because he believed water had healing properties. He was a World War II veteran himself, Pacific Theater, and he'd seen what war could do to a man's spirit. When he came home, he'd spend hours sitting by that lake, just listening to the water and letting it wash away whatever ghosts were following him around. Grandpa Joe used to tell me stories about the lake when I was little. How the Native Americans had considered it sacred water. How the minerals in it came from underground springs that ran deeper than anyone could measure. I thought it was just old man rambling until I saw what happened when we brought Dad there for the first time after his injury. I drove him to the lake on a Sunday morning without telling him where we were going. When we pulled up to the old access road, he got this strange look on his face, like he was remembering something he'd forgotten. "Is this Joe's place?" he asked quietly. I nodded and helped him into his wheelchair. We made our way down to the water's edge, and I'll never forget what happened next. Dad started crying. Not sad crying, but the kind of release that comes when something heavy finally lifts off your chest. "I can feel my legs in the water," he whispered. It wasn't a miracle cure. Dad wasn't going to walk again. But something about that lake gave him back pieces of himself that I thought were gone forever. The water was warm from the thermal springs underneath, and when he'd sit there with his feet submerged, the constant pain in his back would ease up. More importantly, his mind would quiet down. We started coming every morning. It became our routine, our therapy, our church. Dad would tell me stories about his military service, not the dark ones, but the good memories of brotherhood and purpose. He'd watch the sunrise over the water and talk about plans for the future instead of dwelling on the past. Within a year, Dad was like a different person. Still disabled, still dealing with chronic pain, but alive again in ways that mattered. He started volunteering at the VIA hospital, counseling other veterans who were struggling with similar injuries. He learned to drive a modified vehicle so he could get around independently. He even started dating again, meeting Sarah at a veteran support group. That lake saved my father's life. I'm not being dramatic or sentimental. I'm stating a medical fact. His doctors were amazed at his psychological recovery, his improved pain management, his renewed sense of purpose. When they asked what had changed, he told them about the lake. So when we decided to move to Pine Lake Estates permanently in 2019, it felt like coming home. The HOA fees were steep, but we were buying more than just a house. We were investing in Dad's continued recovery, his quality of life, his happiness. The real estate agent assured us that lake access was included for all residents, that it was one of the community's main selling points. For 3 years, everything was perfect. Dad had his morning routine at the lake. The neighbors were friendly enough, mostly retirees who appreciated having a quiet veteran in the community. The old HOA president, Bob Martinez, was a former Navy guy himself who understood what the lake meant to Dad. Bob would even join us sometimes for early morning coffee by the water. Then Bob moved to Florida to be closer to his grandkids, and the HOA board elections happened. Margaret Henderson had been lobbying for months to upgrade the community standards and attract a higher caliber of resident. She won the presidency by promising to increase property values through stricter enforcement of aesthetic guidelines. Her first official act was sending us a letter stating that medical equipment and mobility devices were not permitted in common areas during peak daylight hours because they created an uninviting atmosphere for potential buyers and guests. I thought it was just bureaucratic nonsense at first, something we could work around with reasonable conversation. Dad suggested we could switch to early morning visits before 7 a.m. or evening visits after 6 p.m. We tried to compromise, to be good neighbors, to avoid conflict. But Margaret wasn't interested in compromise. She was interested in control. Every week brought a new complaint, a new restriction, a new way to make Dad feel unwelcome in his own community. Noise violations when his wheelchair squeaked on the wooden pier. Parking violations when we used the handicapped space closest to the lake access. Environmental violations when Dad's medical equipment allegedly leaked fluids into the water. The complaints were all fabricated, but that didn't matter. Margaret had the HOA board behind her, and she had the legal authority to make our lives miserable. More importantly, she had something that I was only beginning to understand, a deep personal hatred for anyone she perceived as imperfect. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't discover until months later, was that Margaret's crusade against my family was about to backfire in the most spectacular way possible. Because while she'd done her research on HOA bylaws and community standards, she'd never bothered to research who actually owned the water she was trying to keep us away from. The adrenaline was still coursing through my veins as I helped Dad change into dry clothes back at our house. His hands were shaking slightly, not from the cold water, but from the shock of what had just happened. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, trying to process the fact that another human being had actually tried to push my disabled father into deep water. "Son, Maybe we should just let this go, Dad said quietly as I helped him into a fresh pair of pants. I don't want to cause trouble for you. That broke my heart more than Margaret's attack had. Here was a man who'd served his country with honor, who'd sacrificed his mobility to save another soldier's life, and he was worried about causing trouble for me. The fact that Margaret had made him feel like a burden was unforgivable. Dad, you're not causing anything, I said firmly. What happened today was assault. We're not letting this go. I made sure Dad was comfortable and safe. Then I walked straight back to the lake. Margaret was still there, but now she wasn't alone. She'd called her usual group of supporters, the neighborhood gossips, who hung on her every word like she was delivering gospel truth. Mrs. Chen from the corner house, Bob Patterson, who ran the community newsletter, and Karen Wild, who somehow managed to be at every HOA meeting with a fresh complaint about something. They were all clustered around Margaret on the pier, and I could hear her retelling the story as I approached. But her version was completely different from reality. He was being completely unreasonable, Margaret was saying, her voice carrying that wounded victim tone she'd perfected over the years. I simply asked them to follow community guidelines, and that man started screaming at me. Then he tried to ram his wheelchair into me deliberately. My blood pressure spiked. She was literally rewriting history in real time, turning herself into the victim and Dad into the aggressor. The three people listening to her were nodding sympathetically, eating up every word. "Margaret," I called out as I stepped onto the pier. They all turned to look at me, and I could see Margaret's expression shift from fake sympathy to barely concealed annoyance. She hadn't expected me to come back so soon. "Oh, here he is again," she said to her audience, like I was some kind of persistent pest. "I suppose you're going to threaten me now too?" "I'm going to give you one chance to do the right thing," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. "You're going to apologize to my father for what you did, and you're going to stop harassing us." Margaret actually laughed. It was a sharp, bitter sound that made my skin crawl. "Apologize? For what?" "Trying to enforce community standards that we all agreed to when we bought our homes here?" "You pushed a disabled veteran toward deep water," I said, making sure everyone on the pier could hear me clearly. "That's not enforcement, that's assault." "I did no such thing," Margaret shot back, but I could see something flicker in her eyes. She knew I was telling the truth, and she knew that I knew she was lying. "Your father lost control of his wheelchair because he was agitated and not paying attention to where he was going." Bob Patterson looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He'd known my dad for 3 years and had never seen him lose control of anything, much less his wheelchair. But Mrs. Chen and Karen Wild were still nodding along with Margaret's story. "There are witnesses," I said, though we both knew that wasn't true. It had been just the three of us by the water. "Yes, there are," Margaret agreed with a smug smile. "Mrs. Peterson saw the whole thing from her deck. She'll confirm that your father was being reckless and that I was simply trying to help him." I felt my stomach drop. Mrs. Peterson was 86 years old, with thick glasses and a grudge against anyone under 60. If Margaret had gotten to her first, there was no telling what story she'd been fed. Margaret was already 3 steps ahead of me, building her defense before I'd even figured out how to attack. "This is ridiculous," I said, frustration creeping into my voice. "You know exactly what you did." "What I did," Margaret said, stepping closer to me, "was try to prevent a safety hazard. Your father shouldn't be operating that wheelchair near the water without proper supervision. What if he'd rolled in accidentally? What if a child had been playing nearby? I was protecting the community." The twisted logic was breathtaking. She'd turned attempted assault into heroic community service in the span of 30 seconds. And the worst part was I could see her little audience buying it. They wanted to believe her because believing me would mean confronting the fact that their HOA president was capable of attacking a disabled person. "Margaret, I saw what happened," I said, trying one more time to appeal to her humanity. "You grabbed his wheelchair handles and pushed him toward the water. That's not protecting anyone. That's assault." Her mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw the real Margaret underneath. Cold, calculating, and completely without empathy. Then she composed herself and put the victim face back on. "I think you're confused and upset," she said in a voice dripping with fake concern. "Which is understandable, given your father's condition and the stress you must be under caring for him. But I won't stand here and be accused of something I didn't do." She turned to her supporters like she was addressing a jury. "This is exactly the kind of aggressive behavior we've been dealing with from this family. First, they ignore community guidelines. Then they make false accusations when asked to comply. How are we supposed to maintain property values with this kind of disruption?" Mrs. Chen made sympathetic clucking sounds. Karen Wilde shook her head disapprovingly. Bob Patterson still looked uncomfortable, but he wasn't speaking up. "You want to talk about disruption?" I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "You just tried to drown a decorated war veteran because you don't like looking at his wheelchair." "I did nothing of the kind," Margaret snapped, dropping the fake concern act. "And if you continue making these slanderous accusations, you'll be hearing from my attorney." There it was. The threat I'd been expecting. Margaret's favorite weapon was legal intimidation, the promise of expensive lawsuits that most people couldn't afford to fight. She'd used it successfully against other neighbors who'd challenged her authority. "Your attorney can call mine," I said, though I didn't actually have an attorney and couldn't afford one. Margaret smiled like she knew exactly what my financial situation was. "I don't think that will be necessary. I think what we need here is a special HOA meeting to address this ongoing problem. The board needs to vote on whether your family's continued residence in this community is compatible with our standards and values." The blood drained from my face. She was threatening to kick us out of our home, to take away the one place where Dad could find peace and healing. And under HOA rules, if enough board members voted that we were causing community disruption, they could actually do it. "You can't be serious," I said. "Deadly serious," Margaret replied. "This community has worked very hard to maintain a certain standard of living. We will not let one family's selfishness destroy what we've built here." She turned to walk away, then paused and looked back at me with genuine malice in her eyes. "Oh, and one more thing," she said. "Keep that cripple away from our lake. If I see him down there again, I'll call the police and have him removed for trespassing." The casual cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. The way she said cripple with such venom, like Dad, was something disgusting that needed to be hidden away. The way she called it our lake like she owned it personally. Margaret wasn't bluffing about the special HOA meeting. 3 days after our confrontation at the lake, every resident of Pine Lake Estates found a certified letter in their mailbox announcing an emergency community standards review scheduled for the following Monday evening. The subject of discussion was listed as ongoing behavioral issues and community disruption by the Torres family. I stared at that letter for a long time, reading it over and over, trying to process the fact that Margaret was actually going through with this. She was going to put my family on trial in front of our neighbors for the crime of existing while disabled. The whole thing felt surreal, like we'd somehow stumbled into some dystopian nightmare where basic human decency had been voted out of existence. Dad took the news worse than I expected. When I showed him the letter, his face just crumpled. Not anger, not outrage, just pure defeat. It was the same expression he'd had in the hospital right after his injury, when the doctors first told him he might never walk again. "Maybe we should just move," he said quietly. "Find somewhere else to live." "Dad, no," I said immediately. "This is our home. That lake is your therapy." We're not running away because some bitter woman has a power complex." But even as I said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes. Margaret's psychological warfare was working. She was making Dad question whether he deserved to be part of this community, whether his presence was really causing problems for everyone else. The cruelest part was that she was using his own kindness and consideration against him. The attacks started the next day. Not physical attacks, but something almost worse. A systematic campaign to make our lives miserable through bureaucratic terrorism. Margaret had clearly spent the weekend strategizing because she came at us from every possible angle. First came the noise complaints. According to the HOA, violation notices that started appearing on our door, Dad's wheelchair was creating excessive noise disturbance during community quiet hours. Apparently, the soft whir of his electric motor was now considered a public nuisance. The fact that his wheelchair was actually quieter than most lawnmowers didn't matter. Margaret had convinced enough board members to sign off on the complaints. Then came the parking violations. Our driveway was apparently 3 inches too narrow for the handicapped accessible van we'd bought for Dad's transportation. The vehicle was now classified as oversized and in violation of community aesthetic standards. We received a formal notice that the van needed to be moved to approved off-site storage within 14 days or face daily fines. The landscaping violations were particularly creative. Our front yard was cited for excessive maintenance requirements because we'd installed a ramp leading to our front door. The ramp, which had been professionally built and approved by the county, was now considered an unauthorized structural modification that detracted from the community's unified visual appeal. Each violation came with its own fine structure. $50 per day for the noise complaints, $75 per day for the parking violation, $100 per day for the landscaping issue. Margaret was literally trying to fine us into bankruptcy, death by 1,000 bureaucratic paper cuts. But the worst part wasn't the money. It was watching what this was doing to Dad emotionally. Every morning, he'd check the front door expecting to find another violation notice. He stopped asking me to take him to the lake, saying he didn't want to cause more trouble. He started spending most of his time indoors, avoiding windows where neighbors might see him and file more complaints. Sarah, Dad's girlfriend, came over one evening and found him sitting in his room with all the lights off, just staring at the wall. She pulled me aside afterward with tears in her eyes. "This is killing him," she whispered. "He's going back to that dark place he was in right after the injury. You have to do something." I wanted to do something, but Margaret was operating within the legal framework of the HOA. Every violation was technically valid under the community bylaws, even if the enforcement was selective and vindictive. She'd turned the rulebook into a weapon, and she was using it with surgical precision. The breaking point came on Friday evening. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I heard shouting from the front yard. I looked out the window and saw Margaret standing on our lawn with 2 other HOA board members, measuring our wheelchair ramp with a tape measure. "This is definitely a code violation," she was saying, loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. "The slope gradient exceeds community standards by at least 15%. I went outside to confront them, but Margaret was ready for me. She pulled out her phone and started recording as soon as I appeared. "I'm documenting the property violations for the board meeting," she announced. "Please don't interfere with official HOA business." "Get off our property," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "This is community property," Margaret replied with that smug smile I'd grown to hate. "The front yard area falls under HOA jurisdiction for compliance inspections." She was technically right. According to the community bylaws, the HOA had the right to inspect any property features visible from common areas. She was using that rule to justify trespassing on our lawn whenever she felt like harassing us. "The ramp was approved by the county," I pointed out. It meets all HOA requirements. County requirements and community standards are two different things, Margaret said, still recording. This community has chosen to maintain higher aesthetic standards than the legal minimum. That's when Dad wheeled himself out onto the front porch. He had heard the commotion and come to see what was happening. Margaret immediately turned her phone toward him. "Perfect," she said. "This will be excellent evidence for the board meeting." I saw something break in Dad's face when he realized he was being recorded like he was some kind of criminal. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time since I'd known him, my father looked ashamed of who he was. "Please stop," he said quietly. "I'll stay inside. Just please leave us alone." Margaret lowered her phone, but the damage was done. She'd gotten exactly what she wanted: complete psychological surrender from a decorated war hero who'd never backed down from anything in his life. "See how reasonable he can be when he tries?" she said to the other board members. "Maybe there's hope for this family after all." After they left, I found Dad in his room with the blinds drawn, crying for the first time since we'd moved to this community. Not the healing tears I'd seen by the lake, but the broken sobs of a man who'd been beaten down by systematic cruelty. "I'm sorry, son," he whispered. "I am so sorry I've brought this trouble on you." That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to fight Margaret on her terms anymore. I wasn't going to play defense against her bureaucratic attacks. I was going to find out everything there was to know about Pine Lake Estates, about the property rights, about the legal foundation that gave her all this power. Because somewhere in all that paperwork, in all those legal documents and property records, there had to be something she'd missed. Some weakness in her armor that I could exploit. Margaret Henderson thought she held all the cards, but she was about to learn that the most dangerous enemy is the one who has nothing left to lose. That weekend, while Dad stayed locked in his room avoiding the world, I became a man possessed. I spread every document we had about the house across the dining room table: the purchase agreement, the deed, the HOA bylaws, the community charter, even the old paperwork from when my great-grandfather first bought property in this area back in 1973. I started with the HOA documents, looking for any loophole or technicality that might help us fight back. The community bylaws were thick as a phone book and written in the kind of legal language designed to confuse regular people. Margaret had clearly studied every page, memorizing every rule she could use as a weapon against families like ours. But as I read deeper, something started bothering me. The HOA had authority over architectural standards, landscaping requirements, noise ordinances, and community conduct. But when it came to the lake itself, the language got vague. Really vague. All residents shall have reasonable access to community recreational facilities, subject to availability and community standards guidelines. That was it. No specific mention of who actually owned the lake, who controlled access rights, or what legal authority the HOA had over the water itself. For an organization that spelled out everything else in excruciating detail, including the exact height requirements for mailboxes and the approved color palette for front doors, this seemed like a massive oversight. I pulled out my great-grandfather's old deed, the one from 1973 when he first bought land around Pine Lake. The paper was yellowed and the typing was faded, but I could make out most of it. What I saw made my heart start racing, including all mineral rights, timber rights, and riparian water rights associated with Pine Lake and its tributaries. Riparian water rights. I didn't know exactly what that meant, but it sounded important. I grabbed my laptop and started researching water rights law, falling down a rabbit hole that kept me up until 3 in the morning. What I learned changed everything. Riparian rights are some of the oldest and most powerful property rights in American law. They give the holder control over water access, usage, and in some cases, exclusive rights to entire bodies of water. These rights typically transfer automatically with property ownership unless specifically excluded in the deed. But here's the crucial part. If riparian rights exist for a property, they supersede almost all other claims to that water, including HOA regulations, municipal ordinances, and even some state laws. The person who holds water rights doesn't just get to use the water they get to control who else uses it. My hands were shaking as I reread my great-grandfather's deed. If those riparian rights had transferred to my family when we inherited the property, and if they'd never been specifically excluded or sold off, then Margaret's entire campaign against us was built on a foundation of legal quicksand. Monday morning, I called the county recorder's office. I needed to trace the chain of ownership from my great-grandfather's original purchase to our current deed, looking for any point where the water rights might have been separated from the land ownership. The clerk, a patient woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, walked me through the process over the phone. Riparian rights are tricky, she explained. They're often included in older deeds, but forgotten about in newer transactions. Let me pull up your property records. I waited on hold for 20 minutes, my heart pounding. Everything depended on what she found. If the water rights had been sold off or excluded at some point, we were back to square one. But if they were still attached to our property, Mr. Torres, I've got your records here. This is interesting. Your great-grandfather's 1973 deed definitely includes riparian rights to Pine Lake. Let me trace forward through the ownership chain. More waiting. I could hear her typing and occasionally making hum sounds that could mean anything. Okay, this is really unusual, she finally said. The riparian rights appear to have transferred intact through every property sale, including the most recent one to you. I don't see any documentation separating the water rights from the land ownership. My legs went weak. What does that mean exactly? It means, Mr. Torres, that according to these records, your family appears to own the water rights to Pine Lake. The entire lake. I'd recommend having an attorney confirm this, but on paper, you're not just a resident with lake access, you're the legal owner of the water itself. I hung up the phone in a daze. Margaret had spent months harassing us about using her lake, threatening to ban us from community water access, when the entire time we legally owned the damn thing. But I needed to be absolutely certain before I made any moves. Margaret was vindictive enough that if I challenged her and was wrong, she'd make our lives even more miserable. I needed bulletproof legal confirmation. I spent the rest of Monday calling attorneys. Most of them wanted retainers I couldn't afford just to look at the documents. But finally, I found David Chen, a property law attorney who'd handled water rights cases before. When I explained the situation, he agreed to review the documents for a consultation fee I could barely manage. This is fascinating, David said when I met with him Tuesday afternoon. He'd spread all the property records across his conference table and had been studying them for an hour. Your great-grandfather was smart. He bought this land right before property values exploded, and he made sure to secure rights that most people don't even think about. So we really own the lake? I asked. You own the riparian rights, which in practical terms means yes, you control access to the water. But here's where it gets really interesting. David pulled out a survey map from 1973. Your great-grandfather's original property included lakefront footage on 3 sides of Pine Lake. When he sold parcels to developers over the years, he retained the water rights while selling the land rights. He traced his finger around the lake on the map. Every house in Pine Lake Estates sits on land that was originally part of your great-grandfather's holdings. The developers bought the right to build on the land, but they never bought the water rights. Those stayed with the family property that eventually came to you. The implications were staggering. You mean the HOA never had any legal authority over the lake? None whatsoever, David confirmed. They can regulate community facilities like tennis courts or swimming pools, but they have no more right to control access to this lake than they do to control access to the Pacific Ocean. The lake belongs to you. I felt like I'd been struck by lightning. All of Margaret's threats, all her talk about community standards and property values, all her rules about who could and couldn't use the lake, it was all built on a lie. She'd been acting like the queen of a kingdom she didn't own. There's more, David continued. Under riparian rights law, you have the authority to grant or deny access to the water for any reason. You can allow whoever you want to use it, and you can ban whoever you want from coming near it. You could literally post no trespassing signs around the entire lake and have the police arrest anyone who ignores them. My mind was racing with possibilities. Margaret had declared war on my family over water rights she didn't have. She'd tried to ban a disabled veteran from a lake he legally owned. She'd spent months terrorizing us with fake authority over property that belonged to us. What would you recommend? I asked. David smiled. I'd recommend you attend that special HOA meeting tomorrow night, and I'd recommend you bring these documents with you. That evening, I sat Dad down and explained everything I discovered. His reaction was exactly what I'd hoped for. The defeated look disappeared from his eyes, replaced by something I hadn't seen since before Margaret's campaign began: hope. You mean that whole time she was trying to keep us away from our own lake? He asked. Our own lake, I confirmed. Dad was quiet for a long moment, processing everything. Then he started to smile. Not a happy smile, but the grim smile of a soldier who just realized the enemy had walked into a trap. Son, he said, I think it's time Margaret learned what happens when you mess with the Torres family. The Pine Lake Estates Community Center had never seen a crowd like the one that gathered Tuesday evening. Margaret had clearly spent the week rallying support because every seat was filled with residents I barely recognized. She'd positioned herself at the head table like a judge, preparing to deliver a verdict, with her stack of violation notices and photographs organized in neat piles in front of her. I arrived exactly at 7 p.m. with Dad beside me in his wheelchair and David Chen, my attorney, carrying a briefcase that would soon turn Margaret's world upside down. The murmur of conversation died down as we entered, and I could feel dozens of eyes tracking our movement to the 3 empty seats in the front row that had clearly been reserved for us, the defendants in Margaret's kangaroo court. Thank you all for coming, Margaret began, standing up with the kind of theatrical authority that comes from years of running PT, meetings and book clubs. We're here tonight to address a serious ongoing situation that affects every single family in this community. She gestured toward us like we were evidence in a criminal trial. For months, the Torres family has consistently violated community standards, ignored direct warnings from the HOA board, and created an atmosphere of conflict that undermines everything we've worked to build here at Pine Lake Estates. The crowd murmured agreement. Margaret had done her homework, priming them with her version of events. I could see Mrs. Peterson nodding enthusiastically from the third row, probably still convinced that Dad had tried to attack Margaret with his wheelchair. Tonight, we need to decide whether this family's continued residence in our community is compatible with the standards and values we've all agreed to uphold, Margaret continued. I want to show you the evidence we've compiled. She clicked a remote, and a projector screen lowered from the ceiling. The first image was a photograph of Dad sitting by the lake in his wheelchair, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens, like he was some kind of criminal under surveillance. This is our community lake during peak daytime hours, Margaret announced. As you can see, medical equipment and mobility devices create an uninviting atmosphere for families with young children. Several parents have reported that their children were frightened by the wheelchair and refused to play near the water. The lie was so casual, so confidently delivered, that I almost believed it myself. But I could see doubt creeping into some faces in the audience. Bob Patterson, who'd known Dad for years, looked uncomfortable. A few other neighbors were shifting in their seats. Margaret clicked to the next slide, a photo of our handicapped accessible van in our driveway. Oversized vehicles that don't conform to community aesthetic guidelines, she said. This impacts property values for every single homeowner in this development. More photos followed, our wheelchair ramp, Dad's medical equipment visible through a window, even a shot of me helping Dad transfer from his wheelchair to his car. Margaret had been stalking us for weeks, documenting our daily lives like we were exhibits in a museum of undesirable neighbors. The pattern is clear, Margaret concluded. This family has consistently prioritized their personal convenience over community standards. They've ignored warnings, made false accusations against HOA leadership, and created ongoing disruption that affects all of us. She paused for dramatic effect, scanning the room to make eye contact with as many residents as possible. The question before us tonight is simple. Do we enforce the standards that protect our property values and quality of life, or do we make exceptions that undermine the very foundation of what makes Pine Lake Estates special? The applause that followed was polite but not enthusiastic. Margaret had made her case competently, but I could sense that some people weren't entirely comfortable with what they were hearing. Kicking out a disabled veteran wasn't the kind of thing most people felt good about, even if you dressed it up in language about community standards. "Mr. Torres," Margaret said, turning toward me with fake courtesy, "would you like to respond to these concerns before we proceed to the vote?" This was my moment. I stood up slowly, looking around the room at neighbors who'd lived alongside my father for 3 years without complaint until Margaret had poisoned them against us. "Actually, Margaret, I'd like to start with a question," I said, keeping my voice calm and conversational. "Can you tell everyone here what legal authority the HOA has over Pine Lake itself?" Margaret blinked, clearly not expecting this line of inquiry. "The HOA manages all community facilities and common areas, including the lake, under the community charter and—" "Specifically the lake," I interrupted. "What document gives the HOA ownership or control over the water itself?" She looked flustered for the first time all evening. "The community charter clearly states that all common areas fall under HOA jurisdiction for the benefit of residents. But who owns the water, Margaret? Who holds the actual legal title to Pine Lake?" Margaret's face was starting to flush. "The lake is a community amenity that's managed by the HOA for all residents according to established guidelines and—" "You don't know, do you?" I said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "You've spent months threatening to ban my family from the lake, but you have no idea who actually owns it." The room had gone completely silent. David Chen stood up beside me and opened his briefcase, pulling out a thick folder of documents. "Ladies and gentlemen," David announced, "I am David Chen, an attorney specializing in property and water rights law. I've been hired by the Torres family to research the legal ownership of Pine Lake." Margaret's face had gone pale. She could sense where this was heading, but she was trapped at the front of the room with nowhere to run. According to county records dating back to 1973, David continued riparian water rights to Pine Lake were purchased by Joseph Torres, Mr. Torres's great-grandfather. These rights have never been sold, transferred, or separated from the family property. Under state and federal water rights law, the Torres family owns Pine Lake. The silence in the room was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop. Margaret's mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no sound was coming out. "Furthermore," David said, clearly enjoying himself, under riparian rights law, the Torres family has the legal authority to grant or deny access to this water body to any person, organization, or entity for any reason. The HOA has no more legal right to control access to this lake than it does to control access to Mr. Torres's living room." I stood up and looked directly at Margaret. "You want to talk about false accusations, Margaret? For months, You've been threatening to ban my disabled father from a lake that he legally owns. You've harassed us, fined us, and tried to drive us out of our home over water rights that belong to us." Margaret finally found her voice, but it came out as a strangled whisper. "This is impossible. The lake is community property. It's been managed by the HOA for 20 years. Managed illegally," David corrected. "Every decision the HOA has made regarding lake access has been made without legal authority. Every fine, every restriction, every threat has been legally meaningless." I pulled out the nuclear option, a formal letter David had drafted that afternoon. "This is a cease and desist order," I announced to the room. "Effective immediately, the HOA is prohibited from making any decisions regarding Pine Lake without written permission from the Torres family. Any further harassment related to our use of our own property will result in legal action." Margaret was shaking now, the full implications of her situation finally sinking in. She'd built her entire campaign against us on a foundation of legal authority she didn't have. Worse, she'd done it publicly, in front of the entire community, creating a permanent record of her incompetence and cruelty. "But you can't," she started, then trailed off as she realized that we absolutely could. "Actually, Margaret, there's one more thing," I said, savoring the moment. "Since you've been so concerned about community standards and property values, I think you should know that we're considering our options regarding future lake access." The room held its breath. Every resident there understood what I was implying. If we wanted to, we could ban the entire community from the lake, turning their primary amenity into our private pond. "Of course, we don't want to be unreasonable," I continued. "We're willing to work with the community on a new lake access agreement, but it will be on our terms, with our rules, and with proper respect for the Torres family's property rights." I looked around the room, making eye contact with as many residents as possible. The only person who will not be welcome at our lake is anyone who has harassed or threatened a disabled veteran over water rights they didn't understand. Margaret collapsed back into her chair, like all the air had gone out of her. The woman who'd entered this meeting as a judge was leaving it as a defendant. Her reign of terror over Pine Lake Estates was over, and everyone in that room knew you might think that having her complete legal authority demolished in front of the entire community would have humbled Margaret Henderson. You would be wrong. If anything, the public humiliation only made her more dangerous, like a cornered animal lashing out in desperation. The morning after the HOA meeting, I woke up to find our mailbox destroyed. Not just knocked over or damaged, but completely obliterated like someone had taken a baseball bat to it repeatedly. Scattered around the debris were the remains of our mail, including Dad's disability benefit checks and medical appointment letters, all torn to shreds. Dad wheeled himself out onto the front porch as I was surveying the damage, his face grim. "She's not going to go quietly, is she?" "No," I said, picking up pieces of our destroyed correspondence. "I don't think she is." I was right. Margaret had decided that if she couldn't use legal authority to destroy us, she'd try a different approach, making our lives so miserable that we'd voluntarily leave the community. What followed was 2 weeks of escalating harassment that would have impressed a professional stalker. First came the anonymous complaints to county code enforcement. Suddenly, inspectors were showing up at our door, claiming they'd received reports of illegal construction, septic system violations, and potential environmental hazards. Each inspection cost us a day of work and hundreds of dollars in fees, even though they all concluded that our property was in perfect compliance. Then Margaret got creative with the utilities. Our internet service was mysteriously canceled due to a customer request that we never made. Our garbage pickup was suspended because of alleged safety concerns about our driveway accessibility. The mail delivery was temporarily halted due to the destroyed mailbox, which the Postal Service claimed created a delivery hazard. But Margaret's most vicious attack was psychological. She started a whisper campaign throughout the neighborhood, spreading rumors that Dad's disability benefits were fraudulent, that he was faking the extent of his injuries to avoid work. She told people that we were planning to sue the HOA and individual homeowners for emotional damages, potentially costing everyone thousands in legal fees. The isolation was brutal. Neighbors who'd been friendly for 3 years suddenly crossed the street to avoid us. Kids who used to wave at Dad when he was gardening started running away when they saw his wheelchair. The community that had been our sanctuary was turning into a hostile environment filled with suspicious glares and whispered conversations. Sarah, Dad's girlfriend, was the first to crack under the pressure. She came over one evening in tears, explaining that Margaret had confronted her at the grocery store with evidence that our water rights claim was fraudulent. She had documents, Sarah said, her voice shaking. Legal-looking papers that said the lake belongs to the city, not to you. She said you're running some kind of scam, that you'll be arrested for fraud when the truth comes out. I reassured Sarah that Margaret's documents were fake, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. Margaret was good at this game, mixing just enough truth with her lies to make them believable. Even people who wanted to support us were starting to question what was real. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning. I was helping Dad with his physical therapy exercises on our back patio when we heard shouting from the front yard. I went to investigate and found Margaret standing next to a county sheriff's deputy, pointing dramatically at our house. "That's the family I told you about, Officer Martinez," she was saying. "They've been making threats against multiple residents, claiming they own community property that doesn't belong to them." My heart sank. Margaret had called the police and was trying to have us arrested for harassment. The deputy, a middle-aged man who looked tired of dealing with neighborhood disputes, approached me with obvious reluctance. "Sir, I need to ask you some questions about complaints we've received regarding threatening behavior toward other residents." I explained the situation as calmly as possible, showing Officer Martinez the water rights documents that proved our legal ownership of the lake. He studied them carefully, then looked back at Margaret with obvious skepticism. "Ma'am, these appear to be legitimate legal documents. What evidence do you have that these claims are fraudulent?" Margaret pulled out a folder of papers that looked official, but were clearly photocopies of photocopies. "I've researched the property records myself, officer. This lake has been community property for decades. These people are con artists trying to steal from honest homeowners." Officer Martinez took the documents from Margaret and compared them to our originals. After a few minutes, he handed Margaret's papers back to her with a dismissive shake of his head. "Ma'am, what you have here are outdated survey maps from the 1990s that don't include water rights information. The documents this family has shown me are official county records that clearly establish their ownership of the lake." Margaret's face turned bright red. "But that's impossible. I've been managing that lake for years. You can't just let strangers come in and steal community property." "Ma'am, they're not strangers, and they're not stealing anything. They own the water rights, which means they have legal authority over lake access. If anyone has been operating outside their legal authority here, it appears to be you." That's when Margaret completely lost it. All pretense of respectability disappeared as she started screaming at the deputy like a child having a tantrum. "This is ridiculous. I am the HOA president. I have authority over this community. You can't let these people destroy everything we've built here." Officer Martinez stepped back, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down right now." But Margaret was beyond calm. 3 weeks of having her authority challenged, her competence questioned, and her lies exposed had finally broken something inside her. "They don't belong here," she shrieked, pointing at our house. "Him and his crippled father, They're ruining everything. This is a respectable community, and we don't want their kind here." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Margaret seemed to realize she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She'd just screamed disability slurs at a decorated veteran in front of a police officer, creating a permanent record of her bigotry and hatred. Officer Martinez looked disgusted. "Ma'am, I think you need to go home and cool off before you say something else you'll regret." But I wasn't going to let this slide. Margaret had spent months terrorizing my family, and now she'd made the mistake of doing it in front of a witness with a badge. "Officer Martinez," I said, "I'd like to file formal complaints for harassment, stalking, and destruction of property, and I want everything she just said on the record." Margaret's face went white as she realized what she'd done. In her rage, she'd destroyed any remaining sympathy the community might have had for her position. She'd revealed herself as exactly what she was, a cruel, vindictive bigot who hated disabled people and wasn't smart enough to hide it. "You can't do this to me," she whispered, all the fight draining out of her. "I've given my life to this community. I've worked so hard to maintain our standards." "Your standards," Officer Martinez said coldly, "apparently include harassment and disability discrimination. You're lucky Mr. Torres isn't pressing for hate crime charges." As the deputy took my statement and Margaret slunk back to her house in defeat, I realized that this was the moment everything changed. Margaret had overplayed her hand so badly that she'd turned herself from a villain into a pariah. The community would never look at her the same way again. But I wasn't satisfied with just defeating her. Margaret Henderson had declared war on my family, tried to drive us from our home, and spent months making a disabled veteran feel like he was unwelcome in his own community. The nuclear option had always been there, sitting in my back pocket like a loaded weapon I hoped I'd never have to use. But Margaret's public meltdown in front of Officer Martinez had convinced me that half measures weren't going to work with someone so consumed by hatred and entitlement. That evening, I called an emergency meeting with David Chen, my attorney. We met at his office, and I laid out exactly what I wanted to do. David listened carefully, occasionally raising his eyebrows, but never telling me I was going too far. "You understand, this will essentially shut down the community's primary recreational facility?" he asked when I finished explaining my plan. "Margaret understands that I legally own the lake," I replied. "What she doesn't understand yet is that ownership means I can exclude anyone I want, for any reason, at any time, including the entire HOA." David smiled grimly. "You want to ban everyone from the lake?" "Not everyone. Just anyone who supported Margaret's harassment campaign or stayed silent while she terrorized a disabled veteran. I've got a list." The next morning, David and I hand-delivered legal notices to every house in Pine Lake Estates. The documents were professionally printed on law firm letterhead and cited specific state statutes regarding riparian rights and trespassing law. The message was simple but devastating. Effective immediately, access to Pine Lake is restricted to persons specifically authorized by the Torres family. Unauthorized entry onto Torres family water rights property will be prosecuted as criminal trespass. This restriction applies to all persons who have supported, enabled, or failed to oppose discriminatory harassment of disabled residents. I made sure Margaret got her copy personally. When she opened her front door, I could see the defeat in her eyes before she even read the document. She knew this was coming, but that didn't make it any less crushing. "You can't do this," she said weakly, scanning the legal notice. "The lake is the heart of this community. Property values will collapse." "You should have thought about that before you tried to drown my father," I replied. "You wanted to control who gets to use the lake, Margaret. Congratulations. Now I control it, and you're permanently banned." The community reaction was swift and brutal. Within hours, my phone was ringing non-stop with neighbors begging me to reconsider. These were the same people who'd sat in silence while Margaret had publicly humiliated my family, who'd nodded along when she tried to kick us out of our own home. Mrs. Chen called first, crying into the phone about how her grandchildren loved feeding the ducks at the lake. Bob Patterson sent a rambling email explaining how he'd never really supported Margaret, that he'd just been trying to avoid conflict. Karen Wilde actually showed up at my door with a casserole and a sob story about her property values. But the most satisfying call came from Margaret herself, 3 days after the ban went into effect. Her voice was barely a whisper, all the fight drained out of her. "Please," she said, "I'll resign from the HOA. I'll apologize publicly to you and your father. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't destroy this community over a personal dispute." "Personal dispute?" I repeated. "Margaret, you tried to drown a disabled veteran because you didn't like looking at his wheelchair. This isn't personal. This is about consequences." "I never meant for things to go so far," she whispered. "I was just trying to maintain standards." "Your standards included calling my father a cripple in front of a police officer," I said. "Your standards included systematic harassment, destruction of property, and disability discrimination. Those aren't community standards, Margaret. That's just hatred." She was crying now, ugly sobs that carried no dignity or grace. "What do you want from me?" I'd been waiting for this question for weeks, and I had my answer ready. "I want you gone," I said simply. "Sell your house and move somewhere else. Find a community that appreciates your particular brand of leadership. Because you're never going to have power over my family again." Margaret's house went on the market the following week. The for sale sign in her front yard was like a flag of surrender, visible from every window in the neighborhood. Word spread quickly that the infamous HOA president, who'd banned disabled residents, was fleeing in disgrace, and the gossip was merciless. But I wasn't satisfied with just Margaret's exile. The community needed to understand what had really happened here and what it meant for the future. I called a voluntary meeting for all residents, held at the community center on a Saturday morning. Nearly everyone showed up, drawn by curiosity and the desperate hope that I might lift the lake access ban. Dad came with me, rolling his wheelchair to the front of the room where Margaret had tried to put us on trial just weeks earlier. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. 3 months ago, I began, many of you sat in this same room while Margaret Henderson tried to drive my family out of our home. You listened to her lies about community standards and property values. Most of you said nothing while she harassed a disabled veteran who'd served his country with honor. The room was dead silent, everyone staring at their hands or the floor. Shame hung in the air like a physical presence. Today, you're here because you want access to a lake that legally belongs to my family. You want us to share our property with people who couldn't be bothered to defend us when we needed support. Dad wheeled his chair forward and spoke for the first time since this whole nightmare began. I came home from Afghanistan with shrapnel in my legs and damage to my spine, he said, his voice clear and strong. But the hardest part wasn't the physical pain. It was feeling like I didn't belong in my own country, like my sacrifice had made me something to be hidden away. His words cut through the room like a blade. Several people were openly crying. "That lake out there isn't just water to me," Dad continued. "It's the place where I learned to heal, where I remembered that I was still worth something despite my disabilities. Margaret tried to take that away from me because she thought disabled people made her community look bad." He paused, looking around the room at neighbors who'd known him for years. "My son owns the water rights to that lake, but he's not the one who decides who gets to use it. I am. And I've decided that this community has earned a second chance." The relief in the room was palpable, people literally sighing as Dad continued. "But there are conditions," he said firmly. This community is going to elect a new HOA board that includes disability representation. You're going to revise your bylaws to explicitly prohibit discrimination based on disability, age, or medical condition. And anyone who wants to use our lake is going to sign an agreement acknowledging that disabled residents have the same rights as everyone else. The new HOA board was elected unanimously 2 weeks later. Bob Patterson, who'd found his courage after Margaret's departure, was chosen as president. Sarah, Dad's girlfriend, was elected to represent disabled residents and their families. The new bylaws passed with zero opposition. Margaret's house sold within a month, reportedly to a young family with an autistic child who were thrilled to find a community with strong anti-discrimination policies. The irony was perfect. Today, Dad spends his mornings at the lake, just like he always did, but now other disabled residents join him regularly. The community has a wheelchair-accessible pier, a sensory garden for residents with autism, and a buddy system to help elderly residents with mobility issues. Margaret Henderson's reign of terror had one unintended consequence. It forced Pine Lake Estates to become the kind of inclusive, supportive community it should have been all along. Her hatred had backfired so completely that she'd created the opposite of everything she'd tried to achieve. The moral of this story isn't complicated. When you use power to hurt vulnerable people, when you mistake cruelty for leadership, when you let prejudice guide your decisions, you don't just harm your victims, you ultimately destroy yourself. Margaret thought she was protecting her community's standards, but she was actually destroying its soul. And sometimes, just sometimes, the people you try to push down have the power to push back harder than you ever imagined. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that disabled veterans and their families deserve respect and dignity in their own communities, hit that like button and share this video. Subscribe for more stories about people who thought they could abuse their power without consequences. And remember, when someone shows you who they really are, believe them the first time. Because karma doesn't always come when you expect it, but it always comes eventually.